It's Tina, sorry.
Hi, Kina. Nice to meet you.
All
Hi,
right.
Tegan.
Hi, Paula. Nice to meet you. Or maybe see you.
I'll see you. I did a double take when I saw the announcement and saw your name and thought, wait, I know who Tegan Reeves, like it was that out of context recognition.
Yeah.
And so I was delighted to see that you were giving a presentation and glad I could join.
I'm so excited. Thank you.
Well, thank you everyone for being here. So I know we have several events going on campus tonight, and I actually can hear some kids like leaving the upper school thing outside my office. But we'll go ahead and get started and we'll let people in kind of as they come. So I just want to do a quick introduction. Again, we are recording this. So if you don't feel comfortable popping on video or speaking, feel free to put any questions, tech needs, anything like that in the chat, and I'll be happy to help you. My name is Amber, and I'm the director of Lausanne Learning. We are a nonprofit based here at Lausanne Collegiate School with a mission to engage students, empower educators, and transform schools. And if that sounds lofty, it's because it is. But we really believe in the power of community and the power of conversation to really engage everyone, to empower our community, and to make our schools as great as they can be. So we started the speaker series last year. It's been a huge hit. We have had some amazing speakers, and I'm so excited to kick off our 2022 speaker series. They go all year, so we have plenty of opportunities, but this is our first one this semester. We're so excited to have Dr. Tegan Reeves here. Tegan has been kind of a longtime friend of Lausanne Learning and of Lausanne and of Greg Graber, who is our director of SEL and mindfulness. And we're really grateful to have you here. So thank you so much. Dr. Tegan is a researcher. She's a teacher. She really has this mission to, I'm going to just quote your bio that you gave me, although we were just talking about how much we hate bios, of bringing the body back into the collective understanding of learning and resilience. And I love that idea. It's winter. And so I feel like we're all kind of, we're all having that moment in our bodies, right? Where we're like, it's gross outside and I've eaten everything. And like, I feel at this time of the year, like we all get a little disconnected from movement and from our bodies and from kind of just how we feel. I think this is a great time of year to really focus on mindfulness. She has a PhD in educational psychology, a master's in instructional curriculum, a degree, ERYT 500, which you have to explain to me what that is at some point, in yoga, and has done a ton of mindfulness training. Tegan currently works at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital as a research associate and at Rhodes as a part-time assistant professor. So, which is so fun. She also does yoga classes, performance training, mindfulness training, consulting, professional development, you name it, right? So thank you for giving us some of your time tonight. I'm going to turn it over to Tegan, but please, again, feel free to hop in the chat. I'm here if anyone needs anything. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Amber. I just love what Lausanne is doing and everything that you've done to support emotion regulation and mindfulness in schools. It makes a difference. So I am going to share my screen and I have some slides. There's also going to be a few moments where we can maybe stop and recollect. So I'm happy to answer questions throughout, and also would love it if anybody has a question, just pop off mute and ask. We can be a little informal here. So I'm talking about embodied literacy and resilience, and this is not a collective term. This is something that is evolving as we know it, and we'll get into what that means a little bit more. Today, I'm going to talk in three specific parts. I'm going to talk about the science behind this embodied regulation, embodied patterns of emotion, and specifically our embodied stress response and what that has to do with emotion and connection. And then I'm going to talk about patterns that we often see specifically in childhood. And then we'll get into a couple ideas of practices, and we may not actually practice, but I'll certainly talk through what each of these look like. And again, if anybody has questions, Amber has put the chat up, and so please ask on and we'll collaborate as we learn together. So to start, I want to talk a little bit about the body. So we've got our blue girl here. Often when we think about what something embodied might be, we think either about our digestive system or our organs, our brain, or our blood and blood flow. And those are all important parts of the body and certainly in medicine. But we have another system that we tend to ignore, and that's our nervous system. And so you can see blue girl here, right in the middle of her center of her body, in the very center line, in line with the spine, is something called the vagus nerve. And the vagus nerve is really important to understanding how we can feel things like gut reactions. It's also really important for understanding how we associate with other people. And that is all done through what we know of as the stress response. So the stress response is when our body, so I'm going to back up. Way back when we thought that perception was only in our skull. So we only ever perceive reality in the brain. And we are now realizing that it's much, much more than that we perceive through our body as well. And that's what this vagus nerve is allowing for. So as you can see, all of these nerves go throughout our body, and we have both efferent and afferent, meaning sending and receiving nerves through that vagus nerve that tell us, that give us information. And most of the time, it doesn't even go into the brain. Most of the time, these are just giving us a piece or just enough information to let the body react. And this is what we call our autonomic nervous system. Often, what we relate to in this area, or what we understand, is our fight or flight mechanism. But there's something even more important than that, and it's our parasympathetic nervous system. So our fight or flight is sympathetic, and we'll get into that too. But the exact same system is also receiving information that we tend and befriend. We have a system that is telling us whether we're safe. Also, a system that is telling us if we need to speed up or if we are maybe not safe, and that's our sympathetic. What's really important is that we have both of these spaces, and we want to understand that both our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system can be good things. It's really hard to admit that stress can be a good thing, but it can be, right? It's not physiologically, stress is not good or bad. Stress is amping us up. And so we know what happens is that when this nervous system says, oh, I'm in threat, our blood flow goes to the large muscles, because evolutionarily, probably we were running from some kind of large animal, and all of what our body deems the non-essential services stop receiving blood flow and energy, like our digestion and our reproduction. Our breath gets really shallow so that we can maintain that fast pace. Our heart rate goes up. Sometimes our mouth gets dry. Sometimes we have a vasodilation in certain places. Sometimes we feel hotness in our cheeks. All of these things are an activated state. That activated state is good for us because we can run from a tiger. We're not running from tigers anymore, but we're doing something along those lines. And that activated place allows us to do it. And what gets a little bit dangerous is when we stay in that state for too long, or we don't use the energy. exactly the same time, we are also developing a parasympathetic nervous system. And that is when we can relax. That's when someone gives you a hug that you trust and you can just like lean into it. Those are the spaces where we allow for our guard to be down and we can allow for a little bit of relax. There's also a freeze with the parasympathetic, but that happens a little bit later in life. And so I'm gonna keep it at these two so that we can we can really talk about it. So what this all means is that we have a brain that's very important for our perception and perceiving what is around us. But we also have a brainstem and a vagus nerve and a whole body that is perceiving information precognition. So that's receiving information before it even gets up into our brain. And sometimes it never gets up into our brain. And that is being developed from a very, very young age. And it's really important that we allow for the experience of this as we start to develop, because allowing for that experience at a young age allows for emotion regulation, allows for mindfulness, and Greg and her whole team are working on. So we do this, there's something called affect. Affect is a term that defines the precognitive state of perception. Before it's emotion, before it's a label, it's just affect. It's just a feeling. And the feeling doesn't have to be attached to anything good or bad. It's just a feel. And it's potentially happening without any sort of connection to the brain. So when we're talking about affect is the gut reaction, the feeling of being around friends where you're comfortable, all of those things that we don't even have to label and think about. And why affect is so important is that it gives us our pathway to sympathetic or parasympathetic response. The two spaces, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic that I just described earlier, that fight or flight or that befriend and tend, are important for realizing what the system allows, what our whole system allows. And so what happens in a parasympathetic, so at the left side of your screen in a calm space, is that there's a safe amount of room to appraise what's happening, respond to what's happening. There's a safe space where we can kind of figure things out. And this is a really important space in childhood to be able to allow for, I think I maybe want to talk here. I think I want to choose this or want to go to this. And it's a way that we can, in the right places, that we can use our cognition in a really roomy place. And so I'm going to move to the right side of the screen because this is where I think most of us are pretty familiar. When we have the sympathetic response, the space between response and appraisal is not there. So we're not able to say, okay, this is what I'm going to choose. Instead, it's just happening, and maybe we even appraise later. The physiological reason for this is that when we are in fight or flight, all of the things that I described before, the heart rate and the vasodilation, all that, when that happens, we have these like mini micro doses of dopamine. Dopamine sounds like a good thing, but in this, and it is if needed, but in this setting, what the dopamine is doing is it's putting blinders on. So it's in this space where we are in this sympathetic, this activated state, the dopamine is making us go one track. And I think most of us as adults know that. I think we can also, if we think evolutionarily and we think about running from a tiger, we can probably say, if we stopped and looked and said, maybe I should go right and maybe I should go left, and I'm not really sure, that space would probably have us eaten. So it's okay to have the blinders on, and it's okay to have this response where we're trying to create a little bit more space, is to say this is when activation is helpful, and then Our affect is what is creating that activation. So this is when we can strengthen our parasympathetic. Interestingly enough, heart rate variability is something that is studied in adults. What we find with heart rate variability is, if this is something that you haven't heard, the basic idea of heart rate variability is that our heart rate isn't consistent in one line. Instead, it goes up and down. It in fact goes, the heart rate gets faster or accelerates on the inhale and decelerates on the exhale. What we think we know about heart rate variability is that it's actually showing vagal flexibility. So that vagus nerve that's receiving all of this information, the more variable our heart rate, the more it's showing that we can toggle in between sympathetic and parasympathetic, or fast and activating and relaxing or slow. And that toggle in between is in fact shown to have a bunch of health outcomes and wellness outcomes. Again, these studies are in adults, but we can start to learn how we can look at this at younger and younger developmental stages. So this leads us to emotion regulation. This is maybe, as parents, as educators, as people who are around education in any way, emotion regulation. I mean, probably if you read the New York Times, emotion regulation is something that we all are talking about, and it's important. And having the physiological underpinnings of that response, that relaxing or activating, and what sort of information we're getting to create this really helps us understand the model. So up at the top, we see affect. Emotion regulation starts with the felt sense. And the felt sense is our afferent and efferent nerves communicating through that vagus nerve. That affect becomes emotion, but remember, it's precognition. So it's not stuff that we're thinking about, it's how we're feeling. And that will in turn affect how well we are able to attend to a situation. Sometimes in a situation needs the blinders, but often in childhood, that's exactly where we go, is we go to the blinders when we probably need more space. That attention, if it goes to appraisal, allows for space where we can respond, and that impacts the situation. What often happens is that the attention with the blinders and the other things, because we're stressed out and we don't understand how we feel and we're still figuring life out and this whole world, the attention and the blinders go straight to response. And so we don't always have an optimal situation. That in turn affects our affect and the affect of those around us. And so we have a cycle. That's our emotion regulation. And we can kind of understand a little bit about how this works. Thinking again about a brain that is connected to nerves that are receiving information. If it's just a brain, if it's just in the skull, we tend to miss the opportunities to understand why we are going straight to response. Often we think that changing our thoughts will just change our behavior. And if it was that easy, I think all of us would be a lot healthier and happier, and healthier. Apparently, that's the word that I'm making up for today. But I think that we know that it's not just our thoughts. We can't just change our thoughts. This gives us, as parents, as teachers, as humans who have friends, this gives us a lot of space to say, it's not just a thought that you can change, and I can validate your feelings. I can validate your affect, the information that your body is receiving first. That validation goes a long way. Also, as partners, that validation goes a long way. So how does this work in development, and specifically in childhood, as we're looking at some of these growth stages and places? We see it in a couple different areas. In early childhood, we have a concept called attunement. Attunement started with John Bowlby a very long time ago, and he looked specifically at mothers and infants. There has also been a wealth of research since Bowlby that has grown into understanding that precognitive, also preverbal attunement that happens. And so attunement can be defined pretty basically as looking and feeling with somebody. So an infant looks and feels with mother and or caregiver. And it's something that I think we've all maybe witnessed, but maybe not been able to put our finger on it. My goddaughter is, I know all of our goddaughters and daughters and students are the most sensitive, empathetic in the whole entire world, but mine is too. And she can feel the room and she can attune so easily to whether or not she should be smiling or tense. And so we've seen this and we've documented this pretty early on. What is less documented is what's actually happening in the brain and the nervous system. And without putting a 21-point QEEG cap on an infant, which is not really helping us attune anyway, we don't have exactly all of that data. We can make assumptions. What we also know happens in early childhood that's really important in this development of the space in both this variability or receiving information from both calm and activating is play and pretend. And so what play and pretend does for, hi there, I know somebody just walked in and just happy to see you, happy to see everyone. What play and pretend does is that it allows for spaces where we can explore in an affect sense. So often play is thought to be a cognitive activity, and it is not. It is, in fact, an affect, an embodied activity for children to be able to start to associate their affect, their feeling states, with then what their choices are. And play and pretend and being able to explore these sorts of spaces is a really important and safe place for children to start to explore the toggle or the allostasis that we talked about between when I can be and should be activated because I'm a fireman that's about to put out a fire, and when I can be calm and I can be safe because I'm a grandma rocking a baby, and all of those spaces in between. That play and pretend is really important. So this shifts around 4, and also you'll see that there's overlap here. All of these things from a lifespan perspective, they're really impacting each other, and there isn't a very specific stage. In fact, I think that thinking of it in stages is sometimes a little bit dangerous because then we think we haven't passed a stage or need to be in this stage, and our nervous system is just doesn't follow the rules like that. So around 4 and 6, around pre-K, K, sometimes sooner, sometimes later, we start to take perspective. There's a lot of research out there about perspective taking and thinking that my thoughts are different than someone else's thoughts. We often think about egocentrism. And what the research is starting to show is that this is happening less at a later stage, when we're becoming more verbal. And it's actually happening maybe a little bit sooner in this play and pretend, but it's becoming verbal. We're able to verbalize it a little bit later. This leads us to theory of mind. Theory of mind is the idea that someone else is maybe thinking something different than I'm thinking. So I'm sure we're all familiar with Piaget and others who talk about this egocentrism, and that for a good period of time as we grow up, we think that the world revolves around us. And theory of mind is that stage, that next stage into thinking other people are thinking and feeling. Theory of mind is one of the most important and beneficial spaces linked to empathy. So being able to encourage verbalization of other people thinking or other friends thinking or foes thinking, being able to verbalize and talk through that is really, really useful in developing empathy. A little bit later, again, for those of you who just joined, there is definitely an overlap between this because none of these are in exact stages and none of them have to be at certain ages. But a little bit later, after we started to develop theory of mind and perspective taking, we start to learn more about false beliefs so that we can believe something that isn't actually true. There's some great neurological work out of MIT that's looking at some of these false beliefs and where and how they might happen. Then there's also knowledge access, and that tends to happen a little bit later, and it's a little bit more cognitive. Why it's very, very important to note now, and as we're talking about this embodied literacy, is that knowledge access is linked to the parasympathetic, that tend and befriend space. So if you think about it, and for those of you who just joined, you can watch the video and see some earlier slides to show it. But if you think about that space where when we go into the parasympathetic or the calming, and we have space between what our stimulus or our response is, or what we're appraising and how to respond, that space is what really allows us to create knowledge access, to be able to start to formulate understanding and associations. If we are in the sympathetic nervous system, or we're in this fight or flight nervous system, and we have the dopamine and the blinders, knowledge access is a whole lot harder. I think about as a kid how nervous I used to get when I had to read aloud, or how I would just shut down when somebody wanted me to do some sort of flashcards, and that frustration and that space. And what would have maybe possibly been able to happen if I would have been able to down regulate, if I would have been able to shift back into a friend and tend and befriend space, instead of thinking that performance had to happen under pressure. Performance can happen under pressure. That's really great. It's awesome for athletes. There's a bunch of good places where we can, again, stress isn't good or bad. There's a bunch of places where this can really be utilized, but specifically along the developmental lines, being able to find allostasis or toggle and or being able to down regulate and find that safe, soft space is really important. So we've talked a lot about some of the learning and some of the beginning steps of the social emotional learning, but I think that it's also very important to designate the specific areas where social engagement starts to happen in an embodied sense. And so we have these four, I know you can read them all: connection and trust and autonomy and boundaries. And to think of each of these four areas as a space where we're developing and growing is important. And it's also a space where we're constantly testing the waters. Even as adults, we're constantly testing these waters. So when we talk about connection, we're talking about the ability to find attunement and safety and friendship. We're also talking about validation. And so when we talk about affect and the feeling state and the beginnings of any kind of parasympathetic or sympathetic response, one of the first things that happens, especially in childhood, but again, for adults too, is that we seek some kind of connection or empathetic response. Right now, I keep my eyes looking up to Amber in the corner of the screen because I keep looking at her face because we're on Zoom and I'm naturally, hi, thank you. I'm naturally looking for connection. And that's a normal part of human interaction. It's also an important part of validation, because if I was, and of course you would never be doing this, but if I was looking up at the screen, wow, man, times have changed since the first time I wanted to give this talk. If I was looking at the screen and Amber was like typing and had her face here and was doing something else, then that disconnection and that opposite of validation, it helps pull me into a sympathetic state because my body is protecting itself, and then I'll put the blinders on and then I'll talk super fast, and nobody wants that. So we've got connection, and we can maybe wrap our minds around what we're seeking. that connects to, but is very different from trust. Erik Erikson and some of our founding developmental psychologists talk a whole lot about trust at a very early age, because we're developing an understanding of whether or not we're going to get fed, about trust at a pre-adolescent stage, because we're starting to learn whether or not we can read properly the people that we understand. There's a lot of research on gender differences with trust and the ways that boys are more overtly aggressive, but that tends to engender trust, whereas girls are more covertly aggressive, and that tends to drop levels of trust. There's a lot out there that we can understand and grab onto. When we're talking about it in an embodied sense, some of that starts to dissipate a little bit more, and we can start to go back to the concept of affect, the concept of a gut reaction, the ways that we know these afferent nerves are picking up information, and naturally, before it goes into the brainstem, before it goes into the limbic system, Freud is probably rolling around in his grave, but before there's any kind of association in the hippocampus with what happened with parents early on in life, before any of that, our body is receiving information on whether or not we can trust. And if we can start to grasp that affect and that embodied perception is what builds a space of trust, we can really understand where some of this childlike play and friendship and this beautiful innocence comes from, and how we can maybe start to adopt it a little bit and encourage it even more. So then I want to talk about autonomy and boundaries and why these are so important in embodied space. Autonomy is linked to a lot of motivation research. A lot of research in high school and lower schools looks at the level of autonomy, perceived autonomy that a student has, and achievement and self-efficacy. And so the space between achievement and self-efficacy, some of the deciding factors are usually whether or not the student feels some level of autonomy or control. This is built up over time, not just through self-development, but also through what we've learned around scaffolding. And so allowing for a safe enough place where we can get to performance, but then gently starting to let go a little bit more and a little bit more, and building that space where we can make choices. It's also pretty informed by, I'm going to say the T word, but it's the little t, by trauma work. So while some of this is done in adults, some of this research is done in adults, what we have found is that experiences of big T or little t trauma, experiences of high stress situations, high activated situations, and probably specifically high activated situations where there wasn't a resolution, create a level of affect and fear, precognitive affect around autonomy. And when we feel like we don't have autonomy, then our activated states go on high alert. It means that in a trauma-informed way, when we're talking to anyone, any human, we can make more space to give choice, to give autonomy, to give freedom. And that in fact allows all of us, whether we've had trauma or not, it allows all of us, our nervous systems, all of those nerves to say, okay, we can come back to center, we can come back to a centralized place, we might be in a safe place, and to not go into that hyperactivated space. Lastly, are boundaries. Boundaries are constantly explored, and I'm sure every single mother out there knows exactly what I'm talking about, and father, and probably teacher. So we have this cognitive idea that we're constantly pushing boundaries, right? We're constantly like seeing what we can get away with, and that's a very adult way of looking at a childhood behavior, and probably true in some ways. and also okay. But if we think about it from the affect perspective, if we think about it from the embodied perspective, we can start to see that this isn't necessarily a thought through process of I'm gonna push mom and I'm gonna see how far I can go. Instead, there's a autonomic nervous system space of where is this affirm and where is it not, and we're exploring the affect, we're exploring where we can go and how that makes us feel. That's really hard for us as parents and teachers and leaders, because it makes us feel bad, and that's okay, because the oscillation, the toggling between, is also an important part of learning. I have a colleague who really hates when I say this, but we don't become resilient. The trouble with resilience is we don't become resilient unless we've had things to overcome. And I'm not saying to put things in any child's way, because every child is automatically creating their own boundaries and their own resilience. But as we start to see, the goal is maybe not a stress-free life. The goal is maybe not an obstacle-free life, but to be able to toggle, to be able to shift and have that vagal flexibility, it's actually called vagal tone, to be able to move through and be resilient. So the next phase of this is called theory of mind. I've introduced this a little bit. I won't spend too much time on this slide, but I would be remiss if I didn't talk about theory of mind within empathy. This model is where we can see empathy in a much more detailed space. So up at the thought is empathy as a thought. We can empathize with someone through our cognitive process. And that's actually the first thing that we learn. We first learn that cognitive process. Well, I would say probably arguably we are learning without knowing we're learning the felt sense, but we first learn by talking about it. Then we have empathy as a felt sense. So that's the affect. And what's interesting in theory of mind work is that being able to think and talk leads to being able to discern how we feel. And once we are linking those two, once we can think about feeling for someone else, how would somebody feel if I said this? Then we start to say, I feel this way because somebody said this. And that leads to what we would call a learned empathy, that leads to the ability to immediately in the moment feel how someone else feels. Now, again, this is theory of mind research. This is theory driven and works through a lot of elementary school age students, but being able to differentiate and feel how we feel and then learning is a good way for us to really break down the process of learning empathy. Many researchers argue that process of thinking and feeling and then being able to learn empathetic feeling is the cornerstones, if you will, or the first three leading components of an ethical foundation, and that our ethics and values then turn into what we perceive of as our self-identity. Now, I think this is we could dive into this for days and days and days, and I won't. But with this process and with each of these components, there have been many, many links to creativity and imagination, and some of those links they may be measuring the same thing, but what we've seen over and over is to be able to think about how others feel, to be able to feel, then have that felt emotion of someone else hurting, leads to open spaces where we have creativity and imagination. And it's hypothesized that a sense of an ethical compass and identity is what really allows for that creativity and imagination to blossom in adulthood. So, why it all matters. So, as we're talking about building resilience, which I don't think maybe there's ever been a time where it's been more important to talk about building resilience, I'm arguing that we should bring the body into the argument and into the equation. And there are a number of different ways that we as leaders, as parents, as teachers, as friends and partners can bring this into how we interact with the world. The first is with practices. Most of what we really see around mindfulness in today is a practice. Some of it is informal practices like mindful eating, mindful dish cleaning is what Ellen Langer started with back at Harvard in the 70s. Also, we have formal practices like sitting and contemplating, or compassion contemplation, where you're thinking about somebody else and sending out your love to them. Those are all meditation and mindfulness practices. Also, spiritual practices and prayer are mindfulness practices. We're practicing the embodied, felt sense of empathy and connection. There's also awareness. The more we can develop that space between appraisal and response, the more we can develop this toggling between, so that we can be aware of our internal dialogue, our internal reactions to things, the more we can help others develop it. And I think that this is where an awareness practice, a mindfulness awareness practice, for those of us who are teaching in really tough times, might be one of the more helpful spaces. I should probably say here that a misconception about mindfulness is that it clears the mind. It, in fact, does not clear the mind. The clouds don't move. It's not a blue sky. There's no balloons or puppies or teddy bears. It's hard and it's difficult. The practice of becoming aware of every thought that comes up and just saying, thank you, mind, and then coming back and letting it go. What's great about that practice is we strengthen the muscle so that when we start to get into activation, we can say, thank you, mind, or whatever that is, that anchor is to you, and come back to center. There's also two really cool techniques that can help us both build resilience as adults working with children, and also help our children build resilience. Breathing is something we're all doing. It's something that happens. If you're not breathing, you're not here. And it's something that can be conscious. I've always been fascinated with this idea that it's the only thing that you're automatically doing and that you can really be in control of. We now know that you can also control heart rate and to some degree brain waves, but breathing is that space that we can really, really practice. For an adult average height human, optimal breathing in a practice, not in every day, optimal breathing is 6 seconds for the inhale and 6 seconds for the exhale. When we're breathing, this 5.8 seconds is actually the official inhale and exhale for an average height adult human. When we're breathing at this rate, we create a state of coherence. So remember when I was saying that as we inhale, our heart rate goes up, and as we exhale, our heart rate goes down. Breathing at this 5.8-ish seconds, what works for us in our height, allows those two things to overlap and create a state of coherence. That state of coherence, fascinatingly, is linked to a bunch of health outcomes, a bunch of wellness outcomes. It's also time and time again found to be linked to a genuine sense of appreciation, which may be why happier people are healthier people. So when we actually stop and appreciate the sunrise, or the one of my clients the other day appreciated a slug eating a leaf, those are creating coherence, which is creating optimal health outcomes. Breathing at that big, slow rate is pulling breath all the way down into the belly. It's allowing the diaphragm to decompress or go down, which allows the lungs to fill. There is a lot of theory or hypothesis amongst researchers that that's helping myelination in those afferent and efferent nerves. It's massaging the vagus nerve. We don't know those things yet, but what we do know is those deep, big belly breaths create coherence, which allows us to get back to allostasis and improve cognitive flexibility, the toggling in between. Finally, there's something called reappraisal. Reappraisal is the ability to notice when we're activated and remember that stress isn't a bad thing and use that stress for a good thing. I'm super careful when I talk about reappraisal because it can very easily go into like toxic positivity, and that you just, like we were saying before, you just think something good. And that is not what reappraisal is. What reappraisal is it is acknowledging the state that we're in. I'm activated. I'm nervous right now because I'm about to give this talk on Zoom, and this is a feeling that I'm in. And this is an exciting place where my body is giving me the fuel that I need to be able to give this talk. That's an example that I used of reappraisal right before I got onto the Zoom. So those are 4 specific areas. I'm going to stop here and allow for questions. And there's some practices that we may be able to go through. But I'm going to stop here and allow for any questions. And then if some of these practices naturally come up, that we can discuss them.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So I'll kind of kick it off with a question, because something that you said really resonated with me. And I think probably a lot of people my age have this experience too. So my daughter is 13. She's in 8th grade. And we've worked really hard to give her like a really good, I mean, she's not like, we're not mega millionaires, but like a good life, right? And try to kind of keep, bad things from happening. But as someone who grew up really poor and who graduated college in 2007, which means a lot of
before
things.
Yeah.
Sometimes I don't think she feels this, but sometimes I find myself being like, why are you not more resilient? Like, I don't want bad things to happen to you, but like all the bad things that happened to me gave me resilience, and like, wish I had less resilience sometimes because all those things were terrible. But like, that's such a hard thing, I think, as a parent or a teacher to look at kids or our students and say like, man, you've got it easy.
Yeah.
Like, how do I kind of fit in with all of, like, I feel myself like doing the reappraisal step a lot.
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, thank you so much for sharing. I think that that's vulnerability, and it really helps empower all of us to remember that we all come from somewhere. And I too graduated college in 2007. And so I know that survival mode. So the question around resilience in childhood is really tough, because obviously there is a moral component of we don't ever want to force resilience to be learned, right? The other part of it is that we tend to, being human, naturally create the areas that we need to become more resilient. And sometimes those are different than what our parents think are those areas. And sometimes they're the same, and that conflict is what is helping us learn and grow. So there's not as much of a divide between this cognitive learning and feeling what my mom felt and feeling that empathy and learning her story, and then actually physically going through it myself. So being able to maybe share a story in a space where we can be empathetic. Sometimes 13-year-old girls have minimum places where that is there. And then also trusting that as life starts to happen, resilience comes in. Hopefully it's not really bad things. Hopefully it's somebody being mad at us, or it's our bike tire breaking, which I don't know if we ride bikes anymore. Hopefully it's the spaces that we can learn the same lesson without something tragic or any kind of trauma. We learn.
Awesome.
Our nervous systems are primed for it.
Yeah. Well, and I think too that that's a really interesting thing about, like, it doesn't have to happen to you to have the empathy for a person like you care about or you love. Like, I do sometimes tell her stories and she's like, the internet came in the mail, and has no empathy, right? And then, but sometimes has like a lot of empathy, like, oh, like you had to work really hard to afford your school. Like, So I think that,
Yeah.
you know, there is some sarcasm along with the empathy, but that is a really good point, I think, about like, you can have empathy for things that haven't happened to you,
Yeah.
which
And
is great.
they make us resilient just as much. So I think that you also hit on a really good point around empathy. So the important part about empathy is that it's a feeling state, and empathy specifically, if you remember that we think it and then we feel it and then we learn it. The feeling state where we think it goes from our brainstem, where we've got information. This is a brain. So it goes up the brainstem and into the limbic system where we feel. And so then we can, if our frontal lobe is there, we can start to name it, but it has to go here. So not knowing what it's like to get mail or not have internet or not have something available, that doesn't feel right. And we put ourselves in that space where we can think about what it's like to not have this easy access to something, or the frustration, or when, you know, the internet won't work and we remind, well, and that's a whole nother thing, because then I'm sure we're in an activated state, so we can't feel empathy anyway. But it's empathy is feeling, and it has to go through a feeling state.
Okay.
That is what I think a lot of us, sometimes it's hard for us to feel, and sometimes it's safe for us not to feel. Sometimes it's a good thing that we go into an activated space and we're not able to feel. Not all the time, sometimes.
Too many feelings all the time, right?
Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, but it's a really miraculous thing, this body that regulates all of it for us, as long as we're allowing it to be used in optimal ways, and we find where maladaptation happens, then we toggle back.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah, Kina.
Yes. One of the things you said that I kind of resonated right now for my own daughter, again, another 13-year-old, that idea of attunement and seeking that safety and validation and friendship. She has friends, but just a few close friends, but they have lots of friends. So she doesn't feel as valuable, I guess, to some of them, because their circle is much larger. They have more choice. And I feel like one of the questions I have is, how do we guide through that? Like, yes, you do have the safety validation, but also, like you said, how to deal with those feelings and not just react negatively, because that seems to be the first response sometimes.
Yeah, oh, for sure. And it feels so much. Everything feels so much when we are 13 and 14 and 12, but everything feels. So I think that's an interesting thing, because it does feel a little cognitive, right? And it might be a misappraisal, and it might not. So I think maybe step one would be really getting into the affect around connection or the feeling of misconnection. So it might be like a little bit of jealousy, which is good and normal and fine. But like jealousy of my friends are with other people, or it might be I don't get to see my friends as much, right? Like there's a lot of spaces where that exists. Being able to go back to the affect, the feeling space in a calm way that's not activated or shut down, helps us to kind of get to where we're feeling, and then reflecting feelings is the best. It's the hardest thing to do, but it's the best way to validate, right? So I hear you saying that you don't understand how getting emails through the mail would be difficult. And saying that is a validation in itself, right? And she gets to hear. So Kina, in your example, so I hear you saying that you feel whatever that affect ends up feeling like. The best part about this is that the research shows time and time again that there isn't, as far as connection and motivation and social aptitude, which is a word I don't really love, but it certainly doesn't need to be a number of friends, and it doesn't even need to be a quality of friends. That one good connection, even just one with an adult or a peer, helps lead us into this social aptitude or feelings of connection and belonging later on in life.
Thank you.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any other questions? I'm happy to chat longer. It's also okay if you don't want to come on screen.
I think it's a lot to process, to think about how you react to things. I mean, even for adults too. If I'm 37 and can't, like, I still react to things. Like,
right.
We ask our students to do a lot. Like, we ask them to have adult emotions and to react to things as adults. And then I get a text message that irritates me, and there's no space between like reaction and appraisal. Like, it's hard to ask our students to do that too sometimes, I think.
Yeah. So that actually brings up some really cool research that is really new, and we don't quite yet understand it yet. But you know, we always say kids are so resilient, and that kind of feels like a cop out because we're like, oh, they're so resilient, right? We don't know under the age of 16 because we don't have a large enough normative sort of database, but we know at 16 years old, heart rate variability is the highest, and 16 through 19 and 20, it's in the hundreds normatively for all 16, 18-year-olds. And then this is the depressing part, that it goes down and down and down and down, just keeps going down. So there's heart rate variability there's not like a good variability for anybody, but what we can do is we can norm it off of our age, because the only thing we really know other than the nervous system is that we get less and less flexible over time. So that might be some evidence that they really are much more resilient, and that maybe we're giving them the tools that they need to keep toggling in between.
Well, and this is just kind of a shameless plug for Lausanne, that my daughter, it's her first year here, and you know, she's in middle school, and so I see, like, she told me to do a 5-1-7 the other day, which I was like, okay, like, but like, I think that, you know, kids are resilient. And one of the things that is interesting here is that I feel like Lausanne is giving them the tools to kind of harness that resiliency into like a really positive, like the appraisal step and feeling real empathy for each other. You know, I just think that programs like what we're doing here are really, I mean, important for kids because they are so resilient, and because it's a totally different world, you know, than like even when I grew up. It's just it's just different. So
I know, it's so cool. I keep thinking that heart rate variability chart for their generation is just going to stay really high, and then there will be no grumpy old men and you know, no wars, peace on earth, and all of that, I'm sure. But I think that it's really exciting to hear. And for those of you who don't know, a 5-1-7 is we inhale for a count of 5, and we hold for a count of 1, and we exhale for a count of 7. And that can be a number of different things. It's nice to have like names of things and consistency. But as we know, exhaling decreases heart rate. And so by lengthening the exhale, we're allowing the nervous system to downregulate, or we're giving a little bit more space to that parasympathetic side.
It was less calming when my child told me.
I'm so happy that
7.
Sure, yeah. And when my like watch tells me to breathe, I'm like super shallow breath.
Right.
It's like when somebody tells us to calm down. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. My watch tells me to take a mindful moment a lot. And I'm like, you're stressing me out by telling me right now. And they'll be like, time for bed. I'm like, okay, well, I'm more stressed. So leave me alone.
Well, our devices, or good in theory at least.
Yes. Well, if no one has any other questions, Tegan, I want to be respectful of your time too. Yeah, I agree. Paula just said in the chat, a lot to think about. I think that there is a lot. The science part of this is so interesting because I think we hear a lot of just kind of like you mentioned, like toxic positivity. Like we hear a lot of like, go to the woods, fine. And it's like, well, hiking is great, but that's not like, there's so much science behind how we are humans. So thank you for that. I feel like I learned a lot, and it wasn't too academic at all because I feel like I want to think about it, not run screaming like I do for math. So yeah.
Well, thank you so much. And I'm happy to answer any questions. If Amber, if you want to send the attendees my email address, usually give me about 48 hours to respond, but I'm happy to be here, and I love everything that you guys are doing at Lausanne, so I'm happy to support.
Thank you. Well, I want to make sure that I'm respectful of everyone's time. So I just want to say thank you again, everyone, for being here. Our next speaker series events, we actually, if you looked at the very beginning of the year, it was a different date. We moved the date because of spring break, and I knew that wouldn't work. So our next speaker is Dr. Patrice Reed. She's a pediatrician here in Memphis, and she's going to be talking about building resilience in our students. So if you want to learn more about resilience and talking about kind of students from a pediatrician standpoint, that's going to be March 22nd. You'll go the same place to register, and I'll send everyone the recording link and the link to register. And also, Tegan, I'll share your website and your email as well. So if nobody has any other questions, like, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Awesome.
Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye-bye.